Welcome to RPRY's 7th Names Not Numbers film. Thank you for participating in this meaningful event. First and foremost, I'd like to thank all the survivors who came to be interviewed by our students this year. Mr. Michael Epstein, Mrs. Tana Gelfer, Mrs. Lola Kline, Mr. Henry Schanzer, Mrs. Marlete Wandel, and Mrs. Jeannie Wechsler. Thank you. It is very difficult to relive such tragic experiences in your lives, and your courage is inspirational to all of us. You have made an indelible impression on our students, and RPRY is proud to help you share your stories with the world. I must also acknowledge the RPRY 8th graders who acted as researchers, videographers, interviewers, and editors of this project and did their jobs with skill and sensitivity. There are many people who helped out in ways large and small to make this program possible, and I ask you to please look over the credits of the film where many of these people are acknowledged. I do want to thank Chaya Friedman, who was our Names Not Numbers coordinator this year and did an outstanding job managing this intricate program in an extraordinary year. And thank you to Adam Chenoy, our phenomenal filmmaker. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors, whose support enables us to continue Names Not Numbers at RPRY. If you have not yet done so, please consider making a donation by clicking in the link in the description below. When I was in 4th grade, my grandmother, Aleha Shalom, spoke about her experience in the Shoah for the first time. Until then, she had not shared her story, and even my mother only knew a little bit about what she went through. But then a close family friend, who was also my Jewish history teacher, convinced my grandmother to share her story with my class, and the dam was broken. From then until she passed away 3 years ago, she spoke dozens of times, including twice as part of Names Not Numbers at RPRY. That first time my grandmother spoke, even as I was confronted with the horror of what the Nazis had perpetrated, I also remember feeling a sense of pride. I admire the strength of my grandmother and the other survivors. They are deeply inspirational for not only enduring the countless tragedies with which they were confronted during the war, but also for rebuilding their lives afterwards. This is what makes Names Not Numbers so impactful. Learning about the Shoah is so important, but Names Not Numbers does not only engage the next generation in learning. Our students got to know survivors and to hear their stories, and in the process, they were impacted by their personalities. That connection, that relationship with the courageous individuals with whom they interviewed is so influential. This will be an experience that they will always remember. It transcends the learning of history, allowing our students to become part of the Masorah, part of the legacy of our people. By getting to know these special individuals through the medium of their experiences in the Holocaust, our students have acquired role models that they will always keep with them. Tova Fish-Rosenberg created Names Not Numbers, which is now in its 17th year. The program does not focus on the numbers, on the broad historical event of the Holocaust, but rather it focuses on the names, on the individual stories of survivors. Together with her husband Dov, Tova has had an incredible impact on Holocaust education, on the recorded history of the Shoah, and on tens of thousands of people. Shortly, we will hear from Tova, who will introduce the film. But first, I am happy to introduce Sam Blau, a recent RPRY graduate.
Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Lowe, for inviting me to speak. In this week's parsha, Balak, the king of Moab, hires the Gentile prophet Bilam to curse the Bnei Israel so that Moab could defeat them in battle. As he gazes on the Bnei Israel, according to Rashi, he observes, Shira Peschaihem she'enam mechuvanin zeh mol zeh. He saw that the doors of their tents were not facing each other, so as not to see into each other's homes. Bilam is so overwhelmed by this demonstration of modesty that he proclaims, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov mishkanusecha Yisrael. How good are your tents, Yaakov, your sanctuaries, Yisrael. When the Torah first introduces Yaakov, the Torah describes him as Ish Tam Yoshev Ohalim, a simple man who stayed in tents. But just as Yaakov, an Ish Tam, simple man, through his trust and devotion, evolved to become Yisrael, someone who overcame angels, as the pasuk says, Kisaris im Elokim ve'im anashim vatuchal, that you have struggled with angels and with men and prevailed. So too, the Bnei Israel, through their character and modesty, transformed their homes into sanctuaries, mishkanot, suitable for Hashem. One would think that after Bilam observed the Bnei Israel's holiness, he would have reconsidered his desire to destroy them. However, we see later in the Parsha that his recognition of their morality motivated Bilam to become even more committed to destroying them by corrupting their character. Similarly, some argue that the Nazis were so jealous of the purity of the Jewish people that they became obsessed with annihilating them. Participating in the Names Not Numbers program and interviewing a Holocaust survivor was very emotional. We were listening to real stories that happened to real people, not just reading about them in a history book. For example, when Mrs. Gelfer told the story of her mother's surprise conversion to please her husband-to-be before they got married, and then described all the ways Jews were not allowed to live normally, such as not being allowed to get legally married, so her mother could not take her husband's name, it highlighted the loss of freedoms, which was just the beginning of the war against Jews. As we interviewed and filmed survivors during our Names Not Numbers program, we began to empathize with the survivors and feel the tragedy, rather than just listening to it or read about it. Deep understanding of what happened is not just gained by learning the facts, but by experiencing the facts, even if not firsthand. Than through these interviews. This is what Names Not Numbers meant to me. On a personal level, my own names bring me closer to family members and victims. My parents named me after my mother's uncle, Sam, who survived Auschwitz. My Hebrew name is Shimshon Dov. Shimshon was my father's great-grandfather, whose son was murdered by the Nazis in Mauthausen. Dov was one of my grandfather's other brothers, one of 11 siblings who were murdered by the Nazis. All of them were Kedoshim, and we should remember them individually by their names, and not just as one of 6 million. Thank you.
Tell me a fact, and I'll learn. Tell me a truth, and I'll believe. But tell me a story, and it will live in my heart forever. The Names Not Numbers oral history film documentary project is remembering the stories of the Holocaust, and is telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. This unique project is in its 16th year. Over 2,500 survivors and 6,000 students have participated in it worldwide. The students were instructed by teachers and professionals. They learned interviewing techniques from journalists. They learned filming techniques and editing skills from documentary filmmakers. The students interviewed, filmed, and edited the 2-hour interviews with each survivor to make 20-minute oral histories that are compiled in the Names Not Numbers documentary at the school. You're about to view the documentary Names Not Numbers, a movie in the making. This film chronicles the students as they are being trained by the professionals and includes their reflections. In it is embedded approximately 10 minutes from each interview. This is the students' work, their filmed and edited interviews. Through this project, our students are preserving history, and they are the witnesses to the witnesses.
The last, the very last, so richly, brightly, dazzlingly yellow. Perhaps if the sun's tears would sing against the white stone, such a yellow is carried lightly way up high. It went away, I'm sure, because it wished to kiss the world goodbye. For 7 weeks I've lived here, penned up inside this ghetto, but I have found what I love here. The dandelions call to me, and the white chestnut branches in the court. Only I never saw another butterfly. That butterfly was the last one. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto. in the ghetto. Butterflies don't live in here, in the ghetto.
I think of Names Not Numbers as focusing on the past. It's a historical event and that we have to learn about, that we have to remember. But Names Not Numbers is also about the present. It's about each and every one of you and your experience this year, your relationship that you'll develop with the survivor that you're going to interview, and the lessons that you're going to learn from them. Teaching those lessons to the rest of the world, to your children, to your grandchildren. Names Not Numbers is also about the future. In a few years, the Holocaust survivors will not be able to tell those stories themselves, and it'll be your job, our job, to tell their stories for them. So we have this continuum of the past, the present, and the future. I encourage you all to really take full advantage of this amazing, amazing program. The fact that we are here to keep that memory alive, to remind the world about what happened, and to teach the lessons that you can learn from the Holocaust, it's a tremendous responsibility.
Today, 80 years after the outbreak of World War II, 75 years at the end of the Holocaust, the pasuk from Parashat Ha'azinu is more timely than ever. Zachor Yamot Olam. Remember the days of old. But it continues to tell us, how should we remember it? Sha'al avicha v'yakedcha. Ask your father, your forefathers, and they will tell you. And that is exactly what you are doing in your project. You are the last generation that has the privilege to hear the survivors' testimonies firsthand. You are the direct beneficiary of these testimonies. And what are you doing with this? You're making a documentary. The survivors and you are telling the story of the Holocaust for the world to hear, for the world to learn, and to inspire future generations to combat anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred and intolerance. You are learning history, recording history, and preserving history. So we wish you Batzlacha. Can say today, and what's going on in the world, your project is extremely important.
They took us to the train station where there were boxcars, and they pushed in 100 people into each boxcar.
The opening of this project, we learned about the program Names Not Numbers, where kids are able to interview survivors.
Today we saw a film that was done by students, and I thought it was really cool how students did it. It seemed like adults did it because it was so advanced.
From this film, I realized that at such a young age, we are able to do this. We have this amazing opportunity. We shouldn't take that for granted. It's something so important that other people don't have the chance to do that are even older than us.
When I watched the interview, I was very impressed with how they filmed it, and I thought it was very professional of how they did it. I hope that I can do something like that.
Me and my peers learned how to interact with the survivors
and what questions not to ask, so they could tell us their story.
Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It will be your job to get the story of who this person was before the war, what happened during the war, and how they rebuilt their lives after the war.
We should be asking, what did you do before the war? What happened during the war? Did you go to different concentration camps? Did you travel? How were you deported?
How did that happen? Describe what happened to you. Describe where you are. Describe the smells.
And life after the war. Did you go to a DP camp? What did you do there if you did?
You should ask questions that you won't get a yes or no answer. You could ask that you'll get a yes or no answer, but there should be a why or because. It shouldn't just be one or two answers to a question.
If a survivor is giving you one-word answers like yes or no, you need to expand the question to see if you can get more of the story out of that person.
Because we want to dig deeper and hear their story with real emotions, how they went through it.
Look directly at the survivor when you ask them your questions. Listen carefully to what they say, because it might lead to an even more interesting story. Now, sometimes these memories are difficult for a survivor to talk about, and that's why you have the tissues and the water.
We should probably take a break, get them a cup of water, and we should give them a tissue box, and we should wait till they're ready to keep going.
You go as deep as you can go. You're trying to draw out this amazing story that they have overcome from this amazing time period that was so difficult and so depressing that we can't really imagine.
You are the students who are going to bring their stories to life for future generations. The real key is to pay attention, to do your research, and to ask the right questions.
The exhibit that had the biggest impression on me was the model of Auschwitz and the gas chambers, and I wonder what it would have been like to have your life in the hands of a soldier that you've never seen before, either pointing right or left.
After seeing the striped uniform and the numbers on the people's arms in the museum, it made everything more real for me.
I am looking forward to do filming techniques because I like technology and everything.
To use the film equipment was really cool. Being able to use professional cameras.
Using a cell phone is a lot easier because there's a lot less buttons.
With a camera, there's just a lot more buttons, but with a phone, you could just press one button. It was really cool to unfocus it and then focus the camera and to zoom out or zoom in.
It was very cool to be able to play around with the buttons and use it.
I like zooming in and I like focusing the camera on people and trying to get a good image because you're seeing a lot of things on television, a lot of movies. They obviously use cameras. I think it was very cool experiencing that myself.
I enjoyed using the cameras. I felt it was a good experience.
It was fun to film things.
I'm really excited to be able to just talk to a survivor one-on-one. It's just really meaningful.
I've never met a survivor before, and I feel excited to finally interview one and see their story.
I've never met a survivor before, and I feel like it is going to be a good experience to hear about their story.
I've never actually sat down with a survivor to talk about their story, but I'm also a little scared because I'm not sure how she's going to react.
I don't know if she's going to be emotional, and I don't know if I'll be emotional either.
I feel excited but nervous because I've never interviewed a Holocaust survivor before.
We're going to hear their stories, not just people's adaptations of their stories.
I'm really looking forward to meet Mr. Schanzer and to see what he has to say.
Today I'm going to meet Mr. Schanzer, and I feel excited being able to understand more what happened.
Today I'm going to be interviewing my grandfather. I've never really heard his story fully. I've heard bits and pieces.
Today I'm going to meet Mrs. Marlete Wandel. I feel good because we were told before that she has a good story to tell, so I'm going to be excited.
This morning I'm interviewing Mrs. Jeannie Wechsler. I feel so excited that I get to meet someone whose story will probably be life-changing to hear.
I'm going to interview Mr. Epstein, and I feel nervous because he has been through so much, and I haven't been through so much.
Today I'm going to interview my great-uncle, Mr. Michael Epstein. I feel very excited and grateful that I get to be a part of this program.
It's very important to hear the survivor stories, and we're going to be one of the last generations to be able to experience it firsthand.
The biggest question I ever wanted to ask a Holocaust survivor
was, did you still believe in Hashem throughout the whole Holocaust?
I wanted to know if she ever thought of what life would have been like if the Holocaust never happened, if she just grown up in Poland and lived her life there.
I want to ask them, how did you keep your faith during the time that the Holocaust was happening?
How being in concentration camps and going through that, how it affected their emunah.
I've never met a survivor before the day of the interview, and I am truly grateful to be able to finally meet one.
Names not numbers, Mrs. Tana Gelfer, take 1.
Names not numbers, Mrs. Kline, RPRY, take 1.
Names not numbers, Mr. Henry Schanzer, RPRY, take 1.
Names not numbers, Mrs. Jeannie Wechsler, RPRY, take 1.
Names not numbers, Mr. Michael Epstein, RPRY, take 1.
Names not numbers, Mrs. Marlete Wandel, RPRY, take 1.
Please tell us your name.
My name is Marlete Wandel, born Berger. I was born December 22nd, 1930. I was born in Recklinghausen, which is in Germany. The area is called Pommern, and the rest of my siblings were born in Stettin, Germany. My family was middle-class Jewish family. My father was a merchant, textile wholesale, and my mother was tending to her children. We lived a comfortable life in a Jewish environment with a large family around us of cousins and sisters and uncles and aunts. And I was the fourth child of 5. My oldest brother was Felix, then came Eddie, 2 years younger, then came my sister Judith, 2 years younger, then came I, Marlete, 2 years younger, and then I had a brother Achim, 3 years younger. We went to a Jewish school. That means I and my younger siblings, because by that time that I went to school, they needed to be Jewish schools because of our religious affiliations. We were pretty much a community like every Jewish community except smaller. Shabbos and holidays were pretty much the same as anywhere else here. My father brought home fresh fish from the pier because we lived near the ocean, and he brought it home maybe on a Thursday and it swam in our bathtub. And on Friday my mother would kill it and slice it and clean it and cook it. So we had to make the gefilte fish or the fish, whatever, from scrap.
My name is Henry Schanzer. I was born in 1935 in Liège, Belgium. My mother was born in Poland and she immigrated to Belgium sometimes in the 1930s. My father was born in Czechoslovakia. He also immigrated to Belgium in the 1930s. They were married in 1933. I had an older sister, Anna, who was born 1934. I have a twin brother, Bernard, and my brother and I were born March 13th, 1935. My grandmother, Sarah Dvora, who came from a very illustrious Hasidic family, was living with us. My father was an industrial worker. My mother was a housewife.
My name is Michael Epstein, or Zadie. I was born in Lodz, Poland in 1935.
Describe what your parents did to make a living.
My father was a butcher in Lodz. My mother was a seamstress.
Before the war, do you remember Shabbat in your town?
Shabbat?
Yeah.
No, I do not. Before the war, I just remember that I was 3 years old, or 4 years old.
My name is Jean Parnas Wechsler. I was born in Poland. The name of the town was Skalat, September 29, 1938. My oldest brother was Moshe. He was born with a club foot. The second sister is Sally. Then my brother Izzy, my sister Clara, my brother Johnny, my sister Tina, and me, Jeannie. My father was a tailor, and we were very poor people, so he was a tailor to poor people. I do remember sitting around the table and always sitting on my father's lap. My parents belonged to a working man's shul. My mother's mother collected money to fix the shul. The head rabbi from all around those towns came to thank her and wanted to give her a front seat, a gift. She said, no, thank you. But if you do want to give me something, give me a blessing. And he blessed her that she, her children, and her children's children's children should be blessed by God and by people. And my mother lived with this all her life, and whenever we had a miracle, my mother said that it's the rabbi's wish that's taking care of us.
My name is Lola Kline, that's my married name. However, my full name is Lola Belsky-Jencholsky. I was born in Novorodok, which today is called Novogrudek, and during the war, it was actually Poland, not Belarus. I was born in February of 1941. My mother's family had 12 children in it, so did my father's. My mother was one of 2 women, and she had 10 brothers. My father's family was more evenly dispersed. There were half boys and half women. Both sides of the family, they had mills where they ground wheat into flour and sold it in the stores. My family were pretty secular. They celebrated Shabbat, of course. They ate kosher meat, and they celebrated some of the holidays, but they were not that active. The town was pretty well divided. I can't say that there wasn't any anti-Semitism there, but I think the Jews were pretty much accepted in town.
My name is Tana Gelfer. I was born October 7th, 1939 in Berlin, Germany. Great-grandfather was actually the ballet master of the Vienna Opera House, and my grandfather was a concert pianist. He was very famous and all. He had a vibrant personality. Everyone liked him. He always dressed in a tuxedo, top hat, walking stick. And at the turn of the century, my grandfather went to Berlin. When he was there in Berlin, he met my grandmother. Now, my grandmother was born in the northern part of Germany, and she was Protestant. And my grandfather said, we can't get married in a synagogue because you're not Jewish. And she pulled out this piece of paper and said, here's my wedding gift to you. I've converted. After a year, my mother was born. My father was a stockbroker. When they married in 1938, first of all, he had already lost his job. My mother had her lost. Nobody would hire her as an actress because she was Jewish. So she worked in a travel agency for a while. When they got married, there was a decree from Hitler at that time that Jews were not allowed to get married. So my mother and my father were married by a rabbi, but my mother could not take my father's name. So my mother's maiden name was Cohn. The marriage was not considered legal in Germany. So when I was born, I could not take my father's name either. That we weren't allowed to walk on the street at certain times, sit on park benches, go into parks, go shopping at certain times, couldn't use doctors. We had a dog that was poisoned by our neighbors because he was a Jewish dog. And we could not get a vet for him because they were not allowed to practice. So there was a lot of anti-Semitism already before we were deported.
Please describe the day the Gestapo came to your town.
Late at night on a Thursday evening, we young ones were asleep and my older 2 brothers were doing homework in the living room.
My parents were out to a meeting or concert. 3 Gestapo men came up to our apartment and they wanted to see our parents, and the babysitter said they won't be home for a few hours, so they sat down in the living room and they waited. And when my parents came home, they saw a lot of lights from the street in the living room. They assumed bad that they must have come to pick up my father. So my father took off to go into hiding, and my mother went upstairs and confronted the Gestapo, and they said, have your children dressed, wake them up, and take your documents, come with us to headquarters. We just want to examine your papers, and you'll be able to come right back, so don't take anything valuable. So we came to the prison of the Gestapo headquarters, counted there most of our family already. They had been arrested early in the evening, and they kept us there overnight. I found it a change of scenery, a lot of fun. So we played around on the beds of the prison, and we had a great deal of fun in a different environment. So I did not realize at all the real situation. But of course my mother was affected differently. She couldn't be in touch with her husband. There were no cell phones. Here she was, alone with 5 children, and she had to follow the instructions of the Gestapo. She was tremendously affected, but she was a lioness who did a heroic job, always protecting her children. When we came to Poland, we wound up in the city of Radom. Eventually, in 1940, we were in the Radom ghetto. Well, the ghetto kept changing. Was made smaller and smaller by sending more and more Jews out of the ghetto to either work camps, concentration camps, or death. And it was always a problem to find living quarters. And you had to be employed by the Germans to be able to get food rations, to be able to have permission to live in the ghetto. So that was a big problem. And eventually my mother had 4 children. By that time there were only 4 children. One went to America, lived in one room of a 5-room apartment where at least 5 families lived, sharing kitchen, bathroom facilities.
How long were you in the ghetto?
2 years. The ghetto was 2 years while we were there, before it got liquidated.
Germans had a very strong army, and they invaded Belgium very quickly. Shortly after May 10th, 10 members of our family and extended members of the family piled into a little van, and we left Belgium to go to France because we felt that France was a stronger country than Belgium, would stand up to the Germans, and we would be safe there. As we reached the French border, the convoy of automobiles were attacked by German planes, which came down and were strafing and shooting at the convoys of cars. Those of us who were in the van jumped out of the van, and we got on the side of the road. You could see the bombs crashing down on the automobiles. People and cars were just being blown up into the air. Traveled all the way down to the south of France, and then we proceeded northeast. We ended up in Saint-Étienne in the fall of 1940. So we all settled in Saint-Étienne, and we all lived close by. My father went to work in a factory. I do remember being in the shul in Saint-Étienne. I have this recollection of seeing my father hold on to a bench and bow down. In August of 1942, the danger must have been great. My father and my mother placed my brother and me with Monsieur Chrétien, a so-called friend of my father. He was going to take care of us. My father took my brother and me to the bus station to send us off to go and live with this Monsieur Chrétien. And this is something that is indelibly engraved in my memory. I remember the day so clearly. It was a beautiful, sunny, warm day. We were waiting for the bus to come. As we sat on the bench, he took my brother on one knee, he took me on the other knee, and all of a sudden he was shaking, and as he was holding us, he really was crying. And you know, I'd never seen my father cry. He really was crying out loud. He escorted us onto the bus. That was the last time we ever saw him. And we went off to this Mr. Chrétien.
Once the war began, and there were constantly bombs falling every day, we had to go into bunkers, wear gas masks. Do I remember all that? Not all of it. I remember I used to call them the boom boom band. Those were the bombs dropping. I was 3 years old, and I always thought that that's the way life was. I didn't know any different. My father was deported in October of 1942 to Riga, and he was killed in Riga, along with his father, his sister, and his brother. My grandmother, being born Protestant, helped us. It kept us from going to Auschwitz at that time. It kept us in Berlin until 1944. They weren't sure about my mother, how much Christian blood she had in her. So they measured her head, they measured her nose to see how Jewish she was. To me, totally ridiculous. I was just lucky because now my father being Jewish, I was considered totally Jewish, so I was just lucky. My mother worked in forced labor, a company that made Nazi uniforms. One day, when she made the Nazi uniforms, her boss told her to go to headquarters in Berlin and deliver a package. Now, at that time also, all men received the middle name of Israel, and all women received the middle name of Sarah. If you didn't, it would be Auschwitz. And at the gate, they told her to sign in. Of course, she put Johanna Cohn and forgot the Sarah. She looked down at it, and she saw that the officer in back of her saw it too, ripped a piece of paper off and said, "Come with me." And they went into the meeting room where there was this big German SS officer sitting underneath a picture of Hitler, and he put this down, and just as he was ready to look at it, the phone rang. He was so excited. He was walking around with the phone in his hand. He was delirious. They had just captured 30 Jews trying to escape from a camp, and they were able to kill them all. So he was just delighted with this news. He forgot about my mother. My mother took the opportunity and went around the back and went back to work again. And she said, "Thank God, this was so lucky." Well, a couple of days later, we had a friend who was a police officer. He was not a Nazi officer. He was a cop on the street. His name was Zimmerman. He was not Jewish. He brought us food, and my grandmother used to say, "One of these days you're going to get caught." And he said, "I was your friend before, and I'm not going to stop being your friend now." Well, anyway, paper came across his desk to arrest my mother. They had not forgotten about this incident. I've done the only thing I could do. I've burned the papers. Just don't ever mention this to anybody.
When Germany invaded Poland, my father was in the Polish army fighting the Germans. He was not home. It was me and my mother. So many of us ran away from the Germans. My mother and my father had agreed to meet in eastern Poland in a town called Białystok, which was on the Russian border. Białystok had a good Jewish community, big Jewish community. Białystok people were overwhelmed. There was no place to sit, there was no place to sleep, there was no place to eat. It was survival of the fittest in Białystok. We came to Białystok in September of '39, and after Białystok we were all deported to Siberia. Agreement was called the Mutual Defense Treaty, where they divided Poland. Germans got the western part of Poland and the Russians got the eastern part of Poland. And it wound up that since we were in the eastern part, one morning we wound up being in Russia. So what the Russians decided to do is to take forcibly, deported all these people to where they needed labor. And where they needed labor was in Siberia. We were transported in what's called cattle cars. It was probably about 5 to 6 months travel in these cattle cars. We were stuffed with a whole bunch of people into one car, and it took weeks where we slept in the car. There was no room to even lay down. So it was a terrible experience. Remember, Siberia is very cold. Snow is always on the ground. It's very high in the Arctic area. The days are almost 24 hours daylight. We lived in barracks, basically a hut. We had about 6 or 7 families in the hut with maybe one heater for the whole hut. Some of the hut did not have flooring. Food was very scarce to get, very little available, and you had to work 12-hour days. My father was in the coal mines, digging, bringing it up, so we shipped to Central Russia to the army. My mother, with my help, was working in the forest. She wasn't cutting down the trees, but she was trimming the trees. We were in Siberia for a year.
In 1941, they had their first mass killing. It was evident to my family what was going on. My uncles took off for the woods immediately. They were very fit. They were peasants. They knew their way around the woods. They set up a camp in the woods and stayed there during the day. When the killings started, more people started running for their lives. They would, one way or another, find this tiny little camp that my uncles had, and they would join them. This was the only all-Jewish guerrilla fighting, partisan fighting group that was run by Jews. You didn't have to be a young man with a gun to join them. My uncle's group grew to over 1,200 people, and they were protected, and they survived the war. So they had to establish a base where they could be safe for the winter. So they built underground bunkers where anywhere from 12 to 20, 25 people could sleep. They had a temple, they had a jail, they had a school, they had a shop where they would fix rifles. They even had a theater. I came there during the first mass killing in August. I was a baby. I was 6 months when I came to join my family, and I was 9 months old when they had to find a home for me. So about October, November, my family started looking for a Polish family that would take me in. They found a couple who were around 40 years old who didn't have any children of their own, and they agreed for various reasons to take me in. They worked on my father's farm, so he knew them. But they came to an understanding that on a certain day, at a certain time, I was going to be dropped off underneath a window, underneath their window, in their tiny little apartment. They would make believe that they found me. I was a baby, about 9 months old. My parents put a cross on my neck, wrapped me in a blanket, and pinned a note to the blanket saying that I was a Christian child, that the family was too poor to take care of me, and anybody who found me, would they please take me in. My father placed me under this particular window. It was a cold day, and there was lots of snow on the ground. I got cold, I started crying, I wiggled out of the blanket, and so the woman came out, and she said, "Oh, look, here's a baby." And she brought me into the apartment. She and her husband decided to take me to the police station to inform them that they found a child, and could they keep me? And the chief of police said yes. I mean, there were no markings. If I was a little boy, you know, boys are circumcised. There were a lot of non-Jewish families living in that house. And somehow or other, one of the non-Jewish families suspected that I was a Jewish child and went to the police and told them that there was a Jewish child being hidden. My foster parents were summoned to bring me to the police station. Thank goodness I had been there before with them. The police chief recognized the situation, said, "I know about this family." The whole thing was dismissed, and I was never again in danger of being called out as a Jewish child.
My father had an apprentice, was not Jewish, and he was a lot in our house and was very nice to my parents and my parents to him. But the day before the Nazis came in, He was the one that grabbed my oldest brother and said, the Nazis are coming tomorrow, you'll be the first one we'll take care of. And this is what prompted us to leave. So my brother ran home to my mother and told her about it. And my mother said, take your bicycle and ride over the old Russian border, and a cousin of hers lived there. You'll stay overnight. The Germans will come tomorrow. They'll pass by, and then you'll come back. So my brother packed up, took his bicycle. In the middle of the road where he was, he ran into my oldest sister, Sally. And my Sally was very protective over Moshe. Everybody was because of his foot. And she says, well, you can't go by yourself. I have to go with you. Who will take care of you with your foot and all? And as they start moving, comes this handsome dude. If I tell you, he was so handsome. And that was the guy whose name was Israel. And he says, where are you going? And they tell him, and he says, you can't go by yourself. What are you, crazy? Do you know what the soldiers are going to do to you, such a beautiful young girl? If you really are going, then wait here for a minute, and I'll go and get us bikes. And by the time he came back with the 2 bikes, my sister Clara ran into them. She also wants to go, and Sally said to her, no, Clara, you have to go home and tell the parents that I'm going with Moshe and I'll be back in a day or so. Well, when she came home and told this to my parents, my father, he just blew a cork, hearing that Sally was with Israel. My mother was friendly with our new bosses, which was the communists. So when my mother ran to the Russians for help, the guy, he said, what can I do for Sally's mother? And my mother told him that she wants help with transportation, just to go and find Sally and bring her back. Picked up his eyes, and he saw a guy with a horse and buggy. And he said, take this woman and do what she asks you to do. And he took my mother and came to the house. And when my mother came in, the whole family was there, aunts and uncles and cousins. And my mother started packing, and everybody helped her. Finally, when we were all on the wagon, early in the morning, we passed by a chicken farm, and my mother recognized one round shoe, and it was Moshe's, my brother's. And we reunited with them. And Azrael took the reins of the horses and started to turn it around to go back home. When we heard planes come, they started bombing. Our carriage, with all the people on it, including the horse, were not touched, not a nail on any one of us. This young man, Azrael, he took the reins, and we kept going. We so nurtured each other. I was so nurtured by my whole family that without it, I wouldn't have survived.
My mother came to visit us. We spent the whole day with her, and we escorted her back to the bus station. My mother was going to get on the bus when a policeman was going around and checking everybody's papers. The policeman asked my mother for identity card. He checked the list, and he told her, Madame, you are under arrest. My mother said to the policeman, I didn't do anything wrong. What is this? The policeman told her, you are wanted in Saint-Étienne. The police want you, and I am going to escort you and bring you to the police. My mother was a very resourceful individual, and she told the policeman, look, I haven't done anything wrong. The police want me. I will go to the police and I will straighten everything out. The policeman actually let my mother go on the bus by herself on her representation that she would go to the police and turn herself in and work everything out. While traveling on the bus, my mother suspected that something was not kosher. 2 stops before the main stop in Saint-Étienne. She got off the bus. When she arrived at the apartment, she learned that the Germans taken my father away. When we got back to Mr. Chrétien and we told him what had happened, he packed up our valises and told us we're going into town. He actually turned us over to the French police. There was a bunch of policemen asking us, where is your mother? Who are her friends? We didn't know the answer to any of these questions. And the policemen escorted us to a Catholic orphanage. They told us, you'll stay here until we find your mother. The Catholic orphanage was run by very nice nuns. They were very kindly, and they promised us that if we were really good, we could become priests. They gave us what is called by the Catholics a rosary. It's a set of beads. When you count the beads, the Catholics say certain prayers. I don't know where my brother and I got the idea, and I don't know to this day how we had the sense, but when we would count the beads, we would say, God save us, God killed them, God save us, God killed them. One day, as we were walking from the orphanage to the church, 2 men approached us and they said, if you want to see your mother, be at the back of the line tomorrow. So the next day, we stayed at the back of the line, and as everybody was walking into the church, the 2 men took us and we just walked off the line. They were working for an organization called Lozé. Lozé took us and placed us on a farm. We got very sick. After we were on this farm for 2 or 3 months, somebody from Lozé came and saw how sick we were. They took us out from this farm and they placed us in another orphanage in Grenoble. My mother went into hiding. As she was walking in the streets, she saw a Madame Bonhomme. Madame Bonhomme had a dress shop in Saint-Étienne, and from the time 1940 to 1942, my mother had used her services. They had established a very good relationship. So my mother must have looked awful. And she asked her, what's the matter? How come you look so bad? At which point, my mother told her, I don't know what's happening. My husband is deported. I don't know where my sons are. Madame Bonhomme told my mother, I'll help you. And she got false papers for my mother. She risked her life because if the government official had turned her in, she certainly would have been sent to prison if not killed.
What happened was in 1941, the Russians needed more people to confront the German armies. He went to Russia with their general. Polish government at that time in exile said, we'll give you those Polish army if you free our people from the forced labor camps. We were freed. And remember, the forced labor camps in Siberia, we couldn't leave. It was like a prison. But suddenly, one day we were told you're free to go wherever you want to. Well, guess where everybody went to? We went down to the warm weather. We went down to Turkestan, near a town called Tashkent.
How did it feel to be free from Siberia?
We felt great. We had to manage on our own. We hopped on trains. There's no such thing as buying a ticket. All the passenger trains, by the way, were used for the army to transport soldiers to the front. So the only train that you could find was these freight trains. We did what we could to get down to the south. We lived in huts, but they were manageable huts. Remember, this is warm weather now. This is like Florida weather. There's a good-sized Jewish community there in Turkestan called the Bukharian Jews. The town that we were in was a major stop for the Russian army. Soldiers that were going to the front were being transported in trains, but they stopped in this town. So they would want to buy something. When the train came, when the soldiers, they would walk around by the train stop and the soldiers would buy things from them. This is how they made some money. We were able to live a life of freedom.
October 1944. I was 4 years old. I was playing with a little friend of mine. I was with my grandmother and the doorbell rang and she answered it and she saw my mother with the 2 SS officers and she knew exactly what was going to happen. And she sent my little girlfriend home and she put a coat on me. She said her goodbyes, not knowing if she was ever going to see either one of us again. As we were ready to leave, my grandmother called me back and she went in the bedroom, and the teddy bear that my grandfather had given to my mother when she was born back in 1904 had become my toy, and she put it in my arms and she sent me off. And we were taken to the center of town. There were barracks there, some kind of official barracks, and we spent a night there. I was separated from my mother, and I remember it was the most horrible thing to be separated as a small child from your parents. I was put into a building with children, and my mother was in another building with adults. I didn't know what was happening or why we were separated, and I was crying all night and screaming, and we stayed there until the next morning when we were taken to the place of deportation, the train station in Berlin. There were cattle cars, 100 and so people into a cattle car. There was no ventilation. There was a pail there for your necessities. There was no food. You were just standing, crouched next to each other. The smell inside was probably the worst of it all, of human body smells and things after that long a trip. We went to Czechoslovakia, about 30 miles outside of Prague, to a concentration camp called Theresienstadt, or Theresian. When we got there, we were told to line out outside, and there was what they called a selection line. People knew what it was about. If you went to the left, it was absolutely going to Auschwitz. To the right, you would stay in Theresienstadt. The last name of Cohn is about as common in Europe as Smith is or Jones is. Now, remember, I had said that my mother and I both could not take my father's name. We had to stay with the name of Cohn. So they started reading off the names. One by one by one, people went into the line for Auschwitz, where they stayed. And then my mother heard the name Johanna Cohn and child Tana. And she took my hand, started to walk over into the line for Auschwitz, when someone in back of her grabbed the back of her shoulder, pulled her back in line and said, "Didn't you hear? That's me and my daughter." And she took her little girl and she walked into the line for Auschwitz. So we assumed that she knew exactly what she was doing. So we were put into barracks. At times there were as many as 300 people in the barracks. We were lucky, my mother and I were not separated. The bunks were 3 high. My mother and I shared a bunk together. The worst of it probably was the cockroaches, the bed bugs, the lice, whatever crawled came out at night. You were given a piece of bread twice a week, and you had to make that last. There was no toilets. There was a pail. Now, Theresienstadt did have a lot of people who were of mixed blood, who were war heroes, who were famous artists, poets, musicians, quite a few musicians. You didn't make contact with people because they didn't stay around long enough. You didn't form friendships, really. One day there would be 50 children in the nursery, and the next day they would all be gone, most of them be gone. Hitler decided he was going to make a movie to show how great concentration camps were, especially this model, as he called it. This was a model camp, even though thousands of people died in it. He took restaurants and filled them with food, filled the stores with food. Now, he took just the people that just came into the camp who hadn't lost the weight yet, and he gave them clothes to wear. He brought a film director in who was going to make this movie. He had everybody sitting outside with music and having coffee outside. Kids were playing in a playground. The movie was made, and they called it The Town That Hitler Gave Him. Well, Hitler never gave the Jews anything, much less a town. Well, as soon as they left, Everything was taken apart again. The clothes were taken back. The food was taken back. Also, the film director was sent to Auschwitz. So if he had seen anything more than he was supposed to, he was never going to talk about it.
January 45, 45, we were in Birkenau, Auschwitz, where we were sent to the gas chamber. Well, once we got to a concentration camp, men were separated from the women. So my two brothers went to one area of the camp, and my mother, my sister, and I went to another section. And the unusual and lucky part that we had during our concentration camp years was that we three, my mother, my sister, and I, were always together, to the extent that when they were tattooing us with concentration camp numbers, we were able to have 3 consecutive numbers on our inner left arm, which was the most unusual thing, that 3 related people had consecutive numbers and survived the war. When we went into the crematorium, and we were in there, and we expected showers to come. We thought we were in the shower room. We went all naked, squashed together like sardines, all women in a room about this size, with spigots from the top that looked like showers. And actually it was a gas chamber where cyclone gas was supposed to come out from the spigots. It happened that it failed. They did not have enough cyclone gas at that moment, or pipes were sabotaged. There was some miracle, the only one of 2 that happened in all the years of recorded history. We had to walk out of the showers of the crematorium alive, at which point they gave us pashaki, which means prison garbs. Even though we were related to each other, mother and 2 daughters, we were afraid to let anyone at all know that we were related. Because for a slice of bread, a prisoner might have said, oh, that's a mother and 2 daughters, for an extra slice of bread. That's how bad situations were. And the Germans did their utmost to separate friends, relatives. It's part of the psychological process, and therefore we did not acknowledge our relationship, although we were constantly together. Now, I have learned to call my mother Peppy. My mother's first name was Peppy Penina, because I was afraid to call her mother. This was the agreement between us. And we were put to work, and the work was unproductive and very just to keep us tortured and busy. If you can call it food, it was water soup, mostly water soup. If you could find a potato in it, or piece of a potato, you were lucky. They gave us water soup twice a day, mainly, and a piece of bread. Whatever it was, most inadequate, barely sustaining life. Yeah, well, all the camps had sleeping quarters of what they call pritches, which were wooden planks made on 3-story highs, sleeping very close next to each other. No bedding, no linen, maybe a straw that was not clean, full of lice. Bathrooms were for the most part outdoors. To keep yourself clean and healthy was a big problem, a big job. We survived from minute to minute. This was our occupation, to survive.
Again, we were traveling, and then we saw an orchard with cherries. Not just us, a lot of carriages stopped. And we heard planes, that's why we stopped there. And I remember how they held me by my hands and put me down into those trenches, and everybody else did, to hide. But my mother knew that her children were hungry. And I remember seeing her picking up her dress and picking the cherries off the trees where the bombs are flying, and bringing and putting them down to us in the trenches. By the time we were able to come out of there, grounds were covered with people. And again, we all survived. It's getting to be evening, so we looked for a place where to sleep over. And there was an empty hut, and we went inside. We bedded down. In the middle of the night, we heard planes and bombing. Part of the ceiling came off. In the morning, it stopped, and it was quiet. And my brother, Izzy, had the guts to go outside and see what's going on. All around that hut, there were 7 bombs that didn't go off. And my mother said each bomb was meant for one of my children, because she had 7 children. And then one time we stopped and waited for a train, And my sister Tina was very thirsty, and she asked me, and I so clearly remember it, if I would go with her to look for some water. But I knew that I'm not allowed to walk away from the carriage, and I said no. And so she went away. And before you knew it, they started loading the train. My mother looks around, she counts the kids, and Tobel is not there. So I tell them that she went to look for water. And Azriel got on the horse and went to look for how far can she go. She's a little girl. And sure enough, he found her near a house, and she was playing with a little child, and the woman went inside to bring her out a cup of water. And when Azriel saw her, he just grabbed her, and the woman came out with the water, and she never got it. So the train left without us. We got back on the horse and wagon, and we continued. We passed by the train that we were supposed to be on that was bombed, and everybody was dead on it. The Russians helped the people that in our situation. We left the horse and buggy, and we got on the train, and they took us all the way into Russia to the Urals, and they put us in a village. People that lived there advised my father that we should move to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan was the worst time of our hunger and disease, and of course, compared to the concentration camp, we were in paradise. But we had no food. We lived in a barn. There were no place to sleep but on straw, and there were more lice and mice in that straw. For the little kids, I was very much afraid. Everybody was so sick. And so by then we were there 9 months. Everybody, we had typhoid, we had malaria, diphtheria, all these diseases. I have never come across of any other family of our size that survived the horrific things and the closeness to death. It was my mother's brains and Azriel's strength is why I'm sitting here.
Describe any memories you have of your time with your foster parents.
I remember the bombers coming through. I remember bombs falling. I remember a building, it was a barn that was destroyed on the property where I lived. And I remember my foster parents saying to me, never engage with a German. If they talk to you, just stand there, but try not to talk to them. When I initially came to live with my foster parents, I was in a crib. Once I outgrew the crib, they kept the crib. And what they did was they put straw into the crib, and they pushed the crib up against the window, and that was a hiding place. We would hide, and of course they told me, if you ever hear the planes coming, if there's ever an attack, you run into this room. They would put me between them, and they would put their arms around me to protect me. And I don't know how the straw was gonna help, but obviously they felt that it would. I don't remember ever being hungry with them. They took very good care of me. I was with them till I was almost 4 years old.
Were you ever reunited with your parents? Please describe.
I didn't know my parents. They had to kidnap me. And the way they kidnapped me was prearranged through bribes. My parents arranged for my foster father to be called in to the army. My foster mother one day decided to visit her husband, my foster father, and my parents came to get me because they were not going to, my foster parents were not going to give me up. I was in the yard, we were sitting on the ground, we were playing some game. We were sitting in a circle on the ground, and these two strangers came in. They approached the circle, and they wanted to know who Loja was. Loja was my Polish name. And I just sat there. And Victor's sister got up and she pointed to me. She said, that's Loja. And what they said to me was they needed help with some direction to get to Novogrudek, that they were lost. They didn't know how to get there. They brought a bag of candy, that I didn't have to go very far with them, just to the next bend so they would know how to get to Novogrudek. They brought me into the wagon. but they wouldn't let me out of the wagon. And I got hysterical. And for some reason, I must have known that they were Jewish, and I started screaming and yelling, "You dirty Jews, you let me out of here." I was frantic because I was being kidnapped. And also, I hated Jews. I mistrusted them. Now remember, the couple who took me in, they had to teach me to behave this way around Jews, because otherwise I'd be a danger to them and to myself. I had foster parents that I loved, that took very good care of me. And now I had these Jewish parents that I absolutely hated and mistrusted. The foster parents were looking for me, and they found me. And there was a knock on the door one day. I don't know what happened, but my mother grabbed me again with a blanket. I guess she was used to grabbing blankets, threw it over me, and ran out the back door. I don't know what went on, and she went into a neighbor's. Not long after that, my cousin was there. She was quite a bit older than me at that point, and she opened the door, and I saw my foster parents. Well, I ran to them. I grabbed my foster father by the ears, and I was screaming, and everybody in the apartment was screaming, and my mother's trying to, and I felt her, she's trying to grab me from the back to get me out of the apartment, and I'm holding on to my foster father, and I see my foster mother. It was quite a scene. After that particular time, my foster mother would come and spend some nights with me. And those were the only nights that I remember where I felt safe and happy that I was sleeping with my foster mother.
Germany, they knew that they were going to lose the war. What they wanted to do is they wanted to totally get rid of as many concentration camps or any evidence of what had happened as possible. They were going to ship everybody out to Auschwitz. They posted a sign the night before, then the next morning at 7 o'clock, everyone would be lined up and would be taken to Auschwitz. And that's how we found out about it. The camp was going to be totally emptied out again.
So why weren't you taken to Auschwitz?
The Red Cross notified the Russians, and the Russians liberated us about an hour before that 7 o'clock time period. When we were liberated, we were not allowed to leave right away because over 1,000 people died after liberation from disease, from typhus, and they didn't want you to go home and have this disease and spread it among wherever home was. We made our way back to Berlin, and my grandmother was still living in the same house, and our apartment was still standing. It was a total shock of joy, of course, when she opened the door and she saw us.
Describe the day you found out the war ended.
Word got around pretty quick, so we were very happy. We thought we were going to go home, back to our homes in Poland, in Lodz, and meet up with our families and resume our life. Things did not work out that way. Lodz was not bombed, stood the way it was before the war. Our apartments, they were all still there, and Polish people were living there. But even worse than that, they were killing Jews even at that point. Thought we were going to stay in Lodz, resume our life. We stayed there for less than 2 weeks and left. We realized what was happened during the war, that we were insulated from that, and left for Germany. Germany, at that point after the war, was divided into zones, 4 zones. One area was controlled by the British, another one by the Russian, another by the French, and another one by the Americans. We all left for the American zone. Word got around about these displaced person camps. We wound up in a camp called Feldafing.
Describe life in the DP camp.
Interesting. We were supplied with everything. Food, medical care, education. I went to school. I went to Cheder. We learned Hebrew. That is a beautiful, picturesque community like Highland Park or anything like this. beautiful homes. The Germans, when the Allied armies taking over Germany, the Germans ran away from these homes, so these homes were left empty. Displaced persons like us took over these homes. We lived in those homes. We formed our own community. I didn't bring it with me, but we even printed our own money.
We had to get out of Poland in the middle of the night. My parents packed suitcases. We had false papers, and we left Poland. I never saw my foster parents again. We were in Fehrenwald. I had family around me. I heard the stories, and I started to accept the fact that I must be Jewish. Children adapt. My uncles, aunts, we had a lot of family that survived. Surrounded by barbed wire, one large room downstairs and one small room, and a very large room upstairs that encompassed the entire building. There was one toilet, not bathroom, a toilet, in the front hall of the building. There was no place to take a shower, a bath, anything like that. We went to school, but it wasn't school the way it's arranged here. All age groups sat in the same room with one teacher. We were being protected by the American Army. There were no Germans in the camp. There were only Jews. We had a market once a week. I would go to the market with my mother. More often than not, there were raids into the DP camp. So anybody that had any, I don't know, jewelry, if you can call it that, anybody who had anything of value, money, anything, they would dig a little hole in the yard and bury it there, because if anything was found, it would probably be confiscated, stolen. I think life must have been very difficult for adults. But not for the children, because we were sort of free. We could do whatever we wanted to do.
Eventually, we moved from that little village to where my father was in the big city in Chicago. We stayed there till the end of the war. My mother found a way of putting me into a home, and I stayed there till the end of the war. One day they woke us up, and they said in Russian, "The children, get up, the war is over." And they brought us to the windows, and we saw fireworks and the excitement, and it was so joyful. And they brought in little cookies for us, and it was just, not that I understood really what it meant, but, and then a little while after they came to pick me up from there.
Describe the day you were liberated.
They liquidated Birkenau and Auschwitz, and we were taken from camp to camp to camp, and eventually on what they called the Totenmarch, which means the death march. They had no more cyclone gas or munitions to kill us with. They took people out of camp, marching 5 in a row. We had to march very fast with dogs and guards on our 2 sides. And those who dropped dead on the way just fell down, and they were left there on the road. The death march was terribly grueling. It was winter, and we were marched on country roads, not main roads. The country roads were unpaved with 2 ditches on each side for the water to run off. Our footwear was very minimal. How we survived, it was a pure miracle of God. I guess God wanted us to survive for one reason or another. We couldn't do it anymore, so we made up between the 3 of us that we're going to throw ourselves down and pretend to be dead. And we made up, so we all fell down, and we rolled into a ditch on the side of the road. And we rolled on top of an American soldier who was there to spy which way the Russians were coming. We told them who we were, and they brought us to the nearest German village, and they told the German people to house us and clean us. My mother made porridge for us, and gradually it took a few weeks to get our stomachs used to eating. Our stomachs were shrunk and not able to absorb the food. So she saved our lives constantly through her wise actions.
Madame Bonhomme got my mother a job in a castle. My mother told Madame Bonhomme that she wanted to find out where we were, because Loger not told my mother where we were in this new orphanage in Grenoble. She negotiated with Loger, she got my brother and me, and she brought us to her mother's farm. Her mother had a little farm not too far from Saint-Étienne. In the spring of 1943, she placed my brother and me with her mother on this little farm, and we lived on this farm from 1943 to 1945. La Mémé turned out to be an incredible individual who took care of us, and she took care of us as if we were her own children. We had learned the first two lines of the Shema. At night, we would take a shmata, we would cover our heads, and my brother and I, we would say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu, and we just kept it on saying until we would fall asleep. One day she says, I hear you murmuring at night. What are you saying? I told her, we're saying a prayer that we learned. And can you imagine? She said, teach it to me. If it's a good prayer, we'll say it together. Over the 2 years that we lived with her, we had an incredible relationship. And even though she was not our biological grandmother, she really, in many ways, became our adopted and loving grandmother. We stayed with La Mémé then from that time until the end of the war. In the fall of 1945, we were reunited with our mother.
Good morning, everyone. I think you know why we're here this morning, the so-called Emunah session. And I looked at my notes from last year's Names Not Numbers. I actually put the date of last year's Emunah session on my notes, and it said February 6, 2020. And I kept thinking, did anyone in that room appreciate what was about to happen to each and every one of our lives just 2 or 3 weeks later? If only we knew last year, 2020, that would affect each of our lives in every single way possible. Every single aspect of our lives has been overturned because of the pandemic. But there's an amazing lesson that I realized just this week. No matter what challenges happen in this world, there are some things that are so critical, they must continue. And one of those is your education. Because Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Because your Torah education can't stop for anything. That one challenge like a pandemic can't stop your learning from happening. That every second you're learning Torah is precious. If it's the reason you exist, then you don't let anything stop you from doing it. We don't let a pandemic stop us from doing what's important to us. From where do we learn this resilience? From where do we learn these lessons about how to operate like this? The Shoah taught us that even in this Holocaust, the survivors that you interviewed, Torah and mitzvos, did not stop. It's an unbelievable thing, and that's what happened during the Shoah. That's what we were taught. Every opportunity, every day, every breath of life was used to connect to Hashem. These spiritual heroes that we learn about really inspire us to strengthen our faith in Hashem and our commitment to Hashem and our love for Hashem. How is it possible to go through what they did, to suffer like they did, and to emerge with their emunah intact? There were some Jews who went through the Shoah and decided afterwards they gave up their faith. They couldn't handle it. And we are not to judge them because we did not go through what they did. But the truth must be said. The vast majority of Holocaust survivors did not lose their emunah. They did not lose their faith in Hashem. They viewed their survival as a sign that Hashem was protecting them. They saw the hand of God in everything that happened to them every step of the way. We might think our lives are a little challenging, but I think you learned this year that nothing is as challenging as what they have gone through. And look how they emerged.
I think it's very important to still have names without numbers today. Even though there's books, even though there's videos, you don't have this firsthand, like from a survivor. All this is so emotional. How could they make this all up?
Even if you've heard like 1,000 stories, each one is different. So I think it's important to remember all the stories, not just some.
It shows that I should be grateful for every day and every minute of my life.
When she was telling us her story, she just seemed so grateful that we were there, and that really makes me feel special. It's something I'm never going to forget. It's going to stay with me through high school, through college, through my life.
It's just you with the survivor. If you're watching like a YouTube video, then it's not you. It's just someone else who's doing it. And for you to do it, it's a bit more personal and more educational.
6 million Jewish lives were lost and almost 20 million human lives were lost. Those were worlds crashing down. It's a lot of time, but we have to remember our Jewish history, our human history. It was inhumane. We can't just let that go. We can't just forget that that happened.
I feel very fortunate that I'm able to interview Survivor, considering I'm one of the last generations. They should be very proud of themselves that they were able to get through those tough times and make it all the way here to share their story.
I feel scared because if the documentaries are forgotten and archived, then the world will forget about all of these things that happened a long time ago, but not so long ago, and it could happen again.
Say how I was really honored to be able to interview him, and it was just amazing how he was so brave and he survived such a hard part in his life, and I will continue to share his story.
She knitted us all headbands she made different colors, different designs. It was all the basic kind, but was different colors, had sparkles on one of them. Knowing that she brought us a present was showing that she cared and she was actually excited to be doing this. Even through what she's been, she's giving, and she's not only thinking about herself.
The message that I have for you, the most important thing is family and peace, and learn to not hate, to stop and enjoy every good thing that America lets you have.
What I found most moving about Mrs. Wechsler's story was how she was always eager to help others, no matter how difficult it was for her. Like, for example, when she was in a DP camp, she said she struggled a lot in school, but even then she was only good in one subject, but she said that the subject she was very good in, she helped all the other students learn it. So she was just really eager to help others, and that's something I can learn.
I think that if I went through something like she did, I would probably be bitter about it, but she's probably one of the nicest people I've ever met.
After my interview with Mrs. Kline, I learned that there will always be fighters in every situation.
I think you have to be aware of the fact that bullying, calling names, people who are different from you, leads to what we experienced in the war. The only way we can beat anti-Semitism is by appreciating each other and our differences, be it, again, religion, be it customs, and education.
I found the most moving thing in Names Not Numbers was being able to experience the stories of the Holocaust survivors, even through COVID. It was really meaningful being able to still hear their stories through these challenging times.
There is a point to making other interviews because not all the survivors have gotten a chance to be interviewed and to be able to pass it on to our children and grandchildren.
It's important for survivors to share their stories because each one of them had their own stories and a different experience from a different one. It's important to get all the information we can.
It's important to be in the last generation because they're not going to be able to tell like many other people their stories in like a few years.
This experience was different from reading it in books and learning it in class because I was interviewing face-to-face with a survivor and I was truly learning their entire story.
Not to forget the Holocaust is the most important message. Definitely not forget the Holocaust.
I thought it was amazing to see an object from so long ago. To think that you have a teddy bear that's over 100 years old is really amazing to see.
When you teach it firsthand to the younger generations, then the story stays alive for a longer time. You need to continue the story throughout everybody's lives so that nobody forgets it.
My experience was at first nerve-wracking, but as I started to understand her story, I started to feel sad about everything that Mrs. Marlee Wandel experienced.
I think you should keep up what you're doing. I think it's marvelous. Yeshivas are marvelous reminders and schoolings for who you are and what you have to follow. Make you proud Jews, proud people, proud citizens, proud of your country, Israel, because that is very important. And reach out to the older ones, because maybe your parents did not have the same chance you have. Or maybe even some of your grandparents didn't have the same chance that you have of learning.
After this generation, there won't really be anybody else left to say the story. There's going to be a lot more of Holocaust denial, and that shouldn't happen.
I think it's important for us to see how the survivors got through the Holocaust and what life was like then.
Interviewing a Holocaust survivor in person was a lot different than learning it in school because it was more of a personal story and we learned their feelings, not just facts.
Keep learning about the Jewish tradition. Do everything possible to give your children solid Jewish education by sending them to Jewish day schools.
There obviously are still a lot of Holocaust deniers. It's unfortunate, but we gotta spread the history to as many people as we can. If we give this to one person, they might carry it over and over until it reaches many more people.
I have not seen a number before. I felt like it's a proof that it happened, that people wouldn't be able to deny it, and it showed how harsh the Nazis were to people.
I think that we call this program Names Without Numbers because even though some survivors didn't get any numbers, some of them still felt that they were being numbered and not actually being called by their names, just being treated differently from others.
We have to be proud, really very, very proud of our heritage. We really are a nation of priests and we are a holy people. And this is something that was handed down to us and we, in our way, try to hand it down to the next generation.
I'm very inspired by your faith that you kept through those terrible times, and I know that since you can keep doing that, that I can too.
I like to tell them that they are really amazing people for going through all this and still finding the happiness in life.
I would congratulate them about how brave they were and how they still have faith in Hashem.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. I know it's probably hard to do that, but it's very important.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. It was very meaningful and I won't forget it.